What If School Creates DXSlexia? A book by Je'anna L Clements, read by the author. Dyslexia, a poem. Let us clip the wings of butterflies, so they will crawl as required. We have the wisdom to know what matters and should be. Poor cripples, we will heal you of this crazy need to fly. Sit down, sit still, as we do. Turn grey. Please note, this booklet is not an academic or scientific research paper, but a philosophical exploration demonstrating the urgent need for action, supported by appropriate research. And secondly, the scope of this exploration does not include alexia, reading problems acquired as a result of suffering brain damage. Finally, this fence-sitting text will variably refer to dyslexics and to people with dyslexia. The start of my own journey. There's never been a kid in our school, ever, who hasn't learned how to read eventually in their own good time. And we've never had a case of dyslexia in 47 years. A quote from Daniel Greenberg of the Sudbury Valley School. This particular quote is from a podcast interview that Daniel Greenberg did with Lenore Skenazy in 2014. However, Greenberg has mentioned this fact in a number of his own writings. The first time I came across it, I don't recall whether it was in his book Free at Last or maybe the Sudbury Valley School experience, I had to read that quote 3 times. What? Never? It is commonly accepted that between 5% and 15%, maybe even 20% of people are dyslexic. Sudbury Valley School has had many hundreds of young people pass through its doors over the decades. What's more, a disproportionate number of them arrived there after finding a lack of fit with other forms of education. So, what is the statistical likelihood of not even one dyslexic student ever enrolling? How is that possible? It seemed a big thing to claim, but by now I had read enough of Greenberg's work to trust his insight into the learning process, and he also struck me as someone with considerable personal integrity. In addition, when I searched the web, I couldn't find a single dispute of his claim, which surely would have surfaced by now. And yet there it is. You can read it in the transcript for yourself. Lenore: You've never had a kid with dyslexia? Dan: Not one. What is dyslexia actually? The simpler definitions of dyslexia involve the idea of a disorder that interferes with the ability to read. In German, it's called Wortblindheit, word blindness. These days we know that there's a lot more to it than that. On the downside, dyslexia can be associated with a number of different kinds of difficulties that impact both reading and spelling. It's a way of perceiving, processing, and storing information that can lead to trouble understanding the link between letters and letter combinations and their sounds. For example, there can be scrambling and inversions of words and letters. This is the symptom most people associate with dyslexia. There can be a tendency to apparently predict or guess rather than read what is on the page, skip or misread short words such as and to, and struggle with abstract words more than with nouns. Memory retention of sight words can be hard to maintain, even just from page to page. Reading can be exhausting, and even when it's apparently mastered, there can be deficits in comprehension for what has been read. In short, dyslexia can make it almost impossible to teach a young dyslexic to read. And if reading is learned, dyslexia in a school setting can still make it almost impossible to process the quantities of text required to keep up with a mainstream curriculum and testing schedule. Even when reading is mastered effectively, dyslexics can still struggle with spelling. Being able to read a word reliably and repeatedly does not translate to being able to recall the accepted spelling of that word at will. There can also be impacts on the kinds of rote learning, memory, and concentration that current school systems rely on. It used to be believed that the downside was all that there was. Hence the label dyslexia, given that the Greek dys is translatable as bad, difficulty, diseased, abnormal, and faulty, lexia as word or language. People used to, and some still do, comment in surprise when dyslexics achieve significant career success in spite of their dyslexia. In the last few decades, we have increasingly come to realize that it is not in spite of dyslexia that people like Richard Branson, Steven Spielberg, Cher, Whoopi Goldberg, Walt Disney, and Albert Einstein succeed. It is actually because of their dyslexia. Dyslexia has a very significant upside. Dyslexic brains can sometimes struggle with the two dimensions of symbolic and standardized text precisely because they specialize in advanced abilities such as multidimensional processing, making connections, and creative imagination. Some careers, such as acting and filmmaking, engineering, music, and art, are particularly suited to the dyslexic talent. Many dyslexics excel at sports, entrepreneurship, or various kinds of innovation. Imagine someone driving a sports car in top gear while leaning out of the window holding dog leashes as a way to walk the mutts. The car would stall. You might assume that it's broken, when in fact it's just being forced to go slower than it can comfortably manage in that mode. Dyslexic brains come with high-power modes that need to be set aside to some extent when engaging with flat, abstract text. As the young person featured later in this text said in Case Story 2, when he reads, he has to change gears. Having these extra gears is no disability. Quite the opposite. As dyslexic super chef Jamie Oliver points out, the response to finding out that a young person is dyslexic should be to congratulate them on their excellent luck. This is why you will find dyslexia advocates such as Oliver and Branson leveraging their celebrity status in support of the Made by Dyslexia movement in an effort to change public perceptions. What having extra gears does mean is that dyslexics do their best when able to live their lives their own way, rather than trying to do what works best for other people. Which you would think is a pretty obvious statement that is true for everyone, dyslexic or not. In fact, I do think it's true for everyone. However, education departments of the world apparently disagree. We also now know that dyslexic brains don't always experience a reading problem. According to the self-survey at www.madebydyslexia.org, I, the author of this text, am probably dyslexic. Dyslexia often runs in families, and my father's response to reading the draft version of this booklet was a realization that he is an undiagnosed dyslexic with dyscalculia. However, I was reading before I ever got to school. More on this later. My spelling is excellent. I left school carrying the English prize for my year and was placed in the top 100 students in my year for English in a national Olympiad. I was nonetheless considered an underachiever for my IQ, have execrable handwriting, and have never managed to keep a room neat, no matter how hard I try. I also struggled with the procedural type of math taught in schools, barely scraping a pass thanks to lots of hard work and extra tutoring, only to find at university level that I was actually in the very highest percentile for mathematical ability, coming top of my class in both logic and statistics. I'm not going to write an ebook called What If School Creates Dyscalculia. I will rather refer you to John Lockhart for his Mathematician's Lament. Estimates for the prevalence of dyslexia vary widely, but whether the truth is closer to 5% or to 20%, either way, it's still a huge proportion of humanity. If you think about it, these percentages mean that dyslexic brains are only slightly unusual, not actually abnormal in any meaningful sense of the word. Dyslexia is a lot more common than having naturally red hair, possibly even more common than having blue eyes, maybe even more common than being left-handed, another problem that exists largely thanks to school contexts. So, if I am conceding that dyslexia exists in its own right, what am I doing writing a booklet with a title that implies that it might be just a side effect of school? Let's return to the opening of this booklet. Sudbury Valley School, SVS for short, has not had a case of dyslexia for more than 50 years. Statistically speaking, they should have had more than 100. Given how many young people end up at Sudbury Valley School after finding a lack of fit in mainstream schooling, SVS should have had a lot more than 100. But they have never had a case of dyslexia. Not one. We need to take a look at how this can possibly be and what schooling might have to do with it. One of the most widely accepted models of dyslexia is the three-part model developed by Uta Frith. This describes how at the biological level there is often a genetic origin, which at a cognitive level can result in specific processing deficits. And these can lead at the behavioral level to performing poorly in reading and writing. For me, the key point is that Frith underlines the fact that there is a, quote, vast gap between brain and behavior, and that external influences will enter into the clinical picture. What if the answer to how SVS can have been permanently free of dyslexia for over 50 years lies in an exploration of these external influences? To make it easier to explore our current mystery, given that not all dyslexics experience problems with learning to read, such as possibly myself, perhaps it will be useful for the purposes of this text to distinguish between dyslexia, a form of dyslexic neurology that is mostly advantageous, and dyslexia, cases of dyslexia that involve significant reading or other problems. Sudbury Valley School must have encountered dyslexia. Why didn't they ever encounter dyslexia? Why does it matter? The short-term and lifelong consequences of dyslexia. Let's look at two people born within months of each other. Let's take myself versus art world legend and film man Sir Stephen McQueen. Maybe I was born with a dyslexic brain and he was born with a dyslexic brain, and that's all there is to that. In fact, maybe his dyslexic brain is why he's a sir and a legend and I am not. Or maybe I never developed dyslexia while Sir Steve did, due to other factors in our lives. McQueen had to wear an eye patch for a lazy eye. I did not. McQueen had to cope with systemic racism at school. So did I, but I was white. And there are obviously other factors too. Who knows which or what may have made a difference, both to our relative dyslexia and to our relative legendariness. If the difference between dyslexia and dyslexic is merely a matter of genes and luck, then there's not much we can do about it. However, if it comes down to factors that we can change, then that's enormously important, because there's a huge range of possible outcomes for dyslexia. Not everyone ends up a Sir. Lesser known than Sir Steve, but at least as awesome, is the founder of www.noticeability.org, Dean Bragonier. Dyslexic himself, and dad to a young person with the same neurodivergence, Dean believes that shame and self-esteem issues are absolutely critical for dyslexics. He makes the public aware of the disturbing fact that while dyslexics account for 35% of entrepreneurs, 50% of all the rocket scientists at NASA, and a staggering 40% of all self-made millionaires, they also comprise 35% of school dropouts, 50% of the adolescents in drug and alcohol rehab, and 60 to 70% of those variously labeled as juvenile delinquents. Young dyslexics have extremely high rates of depression and anxiety. A study of prisoners in Texas found that around 80% of inmates were functionally illiterate, and almost 50% could be clearly diagnosed as dyslexic. Last, but by far the least, Neil Alexander Puss and others have confirmed that dyslexics are at significantly higher risk for self-harm and suicide. Bragonier points out that during the teen years, young people go seeking their tribe, and group identity is key to self-esteem. If a young dyslexic isn't lucky enough to find a positive peer group based on common interests such as sport and music, the obvious group for youngsters with low self-esteem is the people smoking behind the sheds and getting into shoplifting. It can be a downward spiral from there. That spiral can go a long, long way down. Let's leave behind Sir Steve and go somewhere very else. When I was a teenager in South Africa, few criminals were more notorious than the infamous screwdriver rapist, William van der Merwe. After a premature release from prison in 1989, he added murder to his repertoire. His final victim managed to kill him in self-defense by shooting him with his own gun in a complicated and very lucky maneuver while lying down with her hands handcuffed behind her back. Both his motives and his past were picked over in detail. He had claimed that he was motivated by the addictive feeling of power he had over his victims that helped give vent to his feelings of disempowerment and rage against society. There were many other negative factors in his history, so maybe his dyslexia is not significant. However, the court considered it absolutely key to his problems when he first appeared in front of them for attempted rape at the age of 19. They gave him parole on condition that he get remedial help for dyslexia in order to improve his self-esteem. Perhaps it might have helped, but we will never know. He was in jail for multiple rapes before the year was out. Here's a poignant quote his mother reported from his childhood. He said, "I can't read the words. The teacher just ignores me. The other children laugh at me. I'm not interested. I don't want to go to school." On the one side, we have Sir Richard, Sir Steve, Sir Jamie, Dame Keira Knightley, Caitlyn Jenner, Whoopi Goldberg, and many magnificent more. On the other, we have William van der Merwe and around half or more of your local prison population. Maybe the latter were all born with innately criminal forms of dyslexia, while the former were all born with some kind of more positive dyslexia. So Steve's movies go to some dark places, but he tends to react to injustice with feelings of hurt rather than rage. Enter Amir Baraka, bringing us proof that criminal dyslexics can turn their lives around, even to the point of switching between these two groups. Amir actively attributes his life of crime to his experiences with dyslexia. His quote, "I sit up there for about 10 minutes just floundering through a book, not knowing any of the words, and I knew that day I was going to be a dope dealer," said Baraka of his school experience. Off to a solid start as a convicted felon, he had an awakening while serving 4 years in prison. Quote, "Dyslexia mentally incarcerated me. Living in that mental prison without a release date was horrifying. Getting myself to believe that I can learn to read was a challenge I had to win. So, learn to read he did. He read Malcolm X, he read about Mandela, he created a more positive identity for himself, he got involved in acting, he got released from prison, but more importantly, he released himself from dyslexia into dyslexia. These days he's an author, actor, and dyslexia activist, as well as one of those self-made multimillionaires. These vastly different possible outcomes for dyslexia make it morally imperative that we take action. Of course, a significant number of dyslexics don't fall into either extreme. They're not criminals, but also not celebrities, applying their brilliance in less ostentatious professions, such as paleontology, physics, medicine, law, teaching, business, and more. We wouldn't know about Erin Brockovich if her story had not been made into a movie. Even among these, there are far too many living with unnecessary shame and anxiety, hiding their struggles from employers and even from friends. Aside from the extreme and brutal injustice of abandoning millions of people to an unfair fate rooted in our failure to sufficiently support their right to education, there is an even bigger picture than that. The human race is facing possible extinction. Even our best-case scenarios involve mass-scale suffering on an ongoing basis. We have many, many problems to solve. Dyslexics are a large proportion of our innovators, not only in the arts but in the sciences and in social entrepreneurship. Since turning his life around, Amir Baraka has not only stopped being a problem for his local precinct, he has positively impacted the lives of countless domino ripple effect others by mentoring youth, their parents and educators, and working to improve police-community relations. As Dean Bragonier points out, quote, "There are a lot of problems facing today's society. Some of the most creative, innovative minds are at this moment atrophying behind bars. If it's possible to change that, surely it's worth pulling out all the stops." What are the currently popular solutions, and how much can they help? There has been a growing boom in the number of organizations formed to help change dyslexic reality. One list I found named 32 of them, but didn't even include many that I know of. It's simply not viable to survey them all, but their work seems to fall into three main categories: public education and advocacy to inform more people about dyslexia and change public perceptions as well as dyslexic self-perception; training for parents, educators, and therapeutic workers; support and resources for dyslexics in various forms; multisensory teaching and various kinds of remedial sessions, assistive tech, policies that allow for accommodations and modifications, and so on. Made by Dyslexia is one of the organizations doing really amazing work in this field, and their own website divides their work into changing perceptions, creating solutions, and getting involved. If you are a parent or educator, it's worth noting that in addition to their publicity program leveraging the social capital of multiple dyslexic celebrities, they offer a dyslexic positive self-assessment tool, as well as many other free online resources. They promote early identification of dyslexia and structured phonics-based multisensory reading instruction, as well as offering tech resources in partnership with Microsoft, and advocating for accommodations and modifications to support young dyslexics in being able to cope better within the school system. Let's concede for argument's sake that all of these things can indeed help a lot with dyslexia. If so, how realistic are they to provide at scale, and how reliable are they? Unfortunately, preventive measures and remedial assistance are not always effective. It turns out that supporting dyslexics is actually a very complex and specialized task, and many young people receive insufficient help or help that doesn't help. Even when reading problems themselves are resolved, the process itself often causes significant shame, anxiety, and impacts on self-esteem. Far from being the magic bullet that many of us wish it was, even the famed Orton-Gillinger method, A, can require multiple hours of specialist one-on-one time that simply isn't feasible for everyone, and B, still has a, quote, gap that persists between professional advocacy for OG and the need for scientifically based and peer-reviewed research supporting the efficacy of the method. Furthermore, Catherine Knight set out to study teachers' understanding of dyslexia in England and Wales, locations that are relatively well-resourced and have solidly established education systems. She found that many teachers did not have a solid understanding of dyslexia, nor solid confidence in assisting dyslexics. She concluded that, quote, evidence-based teacher training, which informs teachers of the up-to-date research on the biological, cognitive, and behavioral aspects of dyslexia, is essential to combat misconceptions and ensure that teachers have more nuanced and informed understandings of dyslexia. How reliably can education departments around the world actually achieve this? It's such a worthy and noble aim to train every teacher and support every parent, to identify every dyslexic before they even become dyslexic, to develop foolproof support systems and guaranteed tools, to provide each and every dyslexic with all the resources necessary to minimize the negative impact of their dyslexia as it unfolds. However, there are three fundamental problems with all of this. 1. How realistic is it to reach each and every one of these young people with sufficient and effective support and resources? Even in the most affluent schools in first world countries, it's currently a very utopian aim that frequently fails. How could we ensure that what's offered actually works not just for some, but for all? And are the young people in poorer communities and developing countries to be left to just keep falling through the cracks completely? Made by Dyslexia and similar initiatives are noble and determined and persistent. But even with involvement from giants such as Microsoft, they remind me of that inspirational meme about starfish on the beach. 2. How much help is enough? Obviously, this answer will be different for every dyslexic. Some young people come out of remedial processes and absolutely thrive. Others come out still functionally illiterate in spite of it all. Yet others come out able to read at last, but with horrible self-esteem that is at least as crippling as illiteracy. How could we effectively assess whether a young person has actually achieved their highest personal potential, or even whether the psychological damage on the way is significant or not? Amir and William both went into jail and both came out. What made the difference between them? Can we afford to wait until we know? 3. Prevention is better than cure. If there is any chance that dyslexics can be supported such that dyslexia just does not happen in the first place, surely that would be 100 times better, although a lot less lucrative, than letting it happen and simply trying to minimize the negative results. Generally, this possibility is not even considered. It sounds naive and too good to be true. But is it ethical to dismiss it without thorough investigation? To date, when people other than myself have tried to draw attention to the possibility that allowing young people to use autonomous methods to learn to read might help in preventing dyslexia, they have been met with nothing more than skepticism and summary dismissal. This is completely understandable. Our kids are precious. It's unethical to use them like lab rats, although unfortunately the school system does all the time. But when it's something out of the mainstream and beyond the cultural norm, it can feel as if the risks are just too high. However, there's just too much behind this possibility, and the potential rewards are too high to continue to dismiss this out of hand without at least taking a really good, open-minded look. To those who feel that it is fair enough to dismiss these possibilities without thorough investigation, are you really sure that you want to go down in history as one of the individuals who actively prolonged misery for millions and prevented something wonderful from happening just because you can't be bothered to investigate properly but prefer to rely on your prejudices? Or can you enter into a true dyslexic spirit, go on an adventure together, and see what we do or don't find when we actually take a detailed look? Nobody can yet say for absolute sure what is or is not true about dyslexia versus dyslexia. But nobody can say that it's not worth the bother to find out. The stakes are too high for anyone to dismiss anything out of hand. The Made by Dyslexia Microsoft training course provides the understatement of the century when it tells us that, quote, if individuals with dyslexia are not identified or provided the proper support, their self-esteem can suffer. Dr. Gershon Kaufman, a psychologist specializing in shame, tells us that struggling with dyslexia frequently induces levels of shame equivalent to that experienced by survivors of incest, even with remedial help, sometimes in part because of remedial help. But aside from what verges on trivialization, there is an important phrase missing from that Microsoft sentence. To express the full truth, it needs to say, if individuals with dyslexia who are immersed in a mainstream schooling system are not identified or provided the proper support, their self-esteem can suffer. Daniel Greenberg from Sudbury Valley School presents us with the astounding possibility that individuals with dyslexia who are not immersed in a mainstream schooling system might never develop dyslexia or the associated shame in the first place. What if we don't have to deal with dyslexia at all? What if we can actually head things off from the start in such a way that, like Sudbury Valley School, we never encounter dyslexia at all? Whenever we get to a point where we have to deal with dyslexia, we're gambling with unknown factors that will influence whether we end up with another Sir Millionaire, another quietly brilliant citizen, another self-redeeming Amir, or another femicidal screwdriver rapist. If it's even remotely possible that dyslexia need never exist, and we can find ways to have only dyslexia, then that's something we need to take very seriously. And if you're not ready for the thought that all dyslexia may be preventable, how about this thought? What if we can reliably and significantly reduce the number of instances of dyslexia? What if the smaller number who turn out to really, really need the help can actually get it, because the queue for specialist services is only as long as it absolutely has to be? Next ahas in my own journey. Successful illiterate men say what? Encountering Daniel Greenberg's claim to have no cases of dyslexia was the first time radical thoughts about dyslexia blew my mind. The first, but not the last. A few years later, I happened across Roger A. Clark's study of successful illiterate men, and my mind was blown yet again, in multiple ways. Firstly, I had to pause to unpack just that title. Illiterate men who were nonetheless successful. Clark points out that adult illiteracy interventions tend to be based on two faulty assumptions. Quote, first, that literacy is a necessary precondition for success in life. And second, that illiterate people are lacking in self-confidence, unable to maintain employment, are poor, and are caught in a cycle of deprivation and undereducation. End quote. Wow. These are exactly the same false two assumptions made by mainstream education systems. These two cultural myths are widely and deeply believed by parents, teachers, everyone. Until that moment, I believed them too. They are universally fed to young people as if they were fact. And to a young person busy developing dyslexia and their parents, this message is terrifying. And it's false. Wow, just wow. It was already true in 1993 that you don't need to be able to read to make a success of your life. Sure, it helped, but it was not a terminal issue. And now in the next century, when we even have text to voice and voice to text, the myth is even more hollow. But that's not even the major mind blow I experienced from this study. The second mind blow for me was the fact that Clark uncovered the fact that these men did not experience themselves as disabled by their lack of literacy, but they did find themselves disabled by the social stigma attached to their illiteracy, to the point that they generally had to hide the fact that they couldn't read in order to succeed. In other words, we, you and me, right now, are actively creating a crippling disability for other people out of nothing other than our own prejudice and ignorance. This is huge. But it still wasn't the biggest mind blow for me. The biggest mind blow was about the reasons the study was commissioned. The study was commissioned because the people providing adult literacy classes couldn't figure out why their offerings were not appreciated. Here they were, doing the saintly task of providing help for these poor guys, and these guys were walking out and not coming back. Clark nailed the reason all right. It became clear that men who have made a success of their lives don't appreciate being treated like charity cases. They were interested in learning to read, sure, why not? But classes that viewed them as disabled felt at best insulting. At worst, such classes could trigger people back into the trauma of the disabling shame they've worked so hard to escape. Clark advised program designers that, quote, a deficiency-oriented intervention program that overemphasizes the importance of literacy diminishes the observable accomplishments of the illiterate adult and may fail. By fail, Clark means that the participants begin to feel shamed to the point that they just plain don't come back to class for another dose of shame. The only difference for young people in mainstream education is that they have no choice about coming back to class. We are so used to treating young people as dependent and inferior that we find it hard to understand that young dyslexics have the same kinds of feelings as adult dyslexics. As we will see in the next section, any intervention that focuses on incompetence is bound to fail. So is any intervention that undermines feelings of autonomy. Aside from questions around how well conventional interventions for young dyslexics work, there's a more fundamental problem. The bottom line for all of the current proposed solutions is that they rely on the quality, training, and intentions of the people around the dyslexic, on the extent of accommodations allowed to the dyslexic, and on the quality of materials and tech provided for the dyslexic. They leave dyslexics at the mercy of their socio-economic circumstances and other people's capacity and goodwill. Not only does this mean that dyslexics in poorly resourced environments will continue to fall through the cracks, it also means that dyslexics remain dependent, reliant on charity. All of these solutions are well-meaning but paternalistic. They fail to empower and leverage the talents of the actual dyslexic person's self, such as self-sufficiency, creativity, and inventiveness. Instead, they are based on a view of the dyslexic as being unable to cope without outside help, which fundamentally undermines feelings of competence. Does keeping dyslexics dependent and reliant on charity bolster self-esteem or induce shame? Back to Frith's vast gap between brain and behavior caused by external influences that enter into the clinical picture. The final ahas that led to my current thoughts about dyslexia came gradually as I studied human motivation and well-being and their relationship to learning. What if, instead of external influences, such as what age dyslexia is diagnosed or how it is remediated, what if it is actually the external influences that mediate motivation and well-being that are the key influences that enter into the picture to bring about the difference between dyslexia and dyslexic? Let me unpack that a bit, and then let's see what you think. Understanding the aha, dyslexia, motivation, and shame. Bear with me. I need to touch on some very involved concepts in a very brief way here. Maybe I can pull that off. If not, there's some suggestions in the further exploration section to fill out the gaps I might leave. Here's the pieces of the puzzle that I came across, and the way that my probably dyslexic brain watched them slide into place. 1. From learning about behavioral neuroscientist Stephen Porges, I learned that we need to feel safe in order to learn well. We don't have much ability to choose how to direct our attention when we're trying to survive. Danger directs our attention for us. Different neurochemicals kick in, depending on how safe or unsafe we feel. Even subtle levels of fight, flight, or freeze states that are triggered by relationships or situations that feel unsafe can interfere with learning. When we are anxious, our ears even adjust to help us pick up extremely high and low-pitched sounds that might signal danger, growls and rumbles, fire crackling, and distant screams. Only when we relax do our ears tune in well to the normal ranges of the human speaking voice. In other words, a person who feels anxious or fears being shamed can't easily concentrate. Depending on their unique circumstances, their bodies will tell them either to fight, to flee, or to shut down. In the classroom, this can look like clowning around, acting up, getting distracted, or daydreaming. Chronically, it can look like psychosomatic illnesses, school refusal, anxiety, defiance, zoning out, or depression. 2. From learning about the self-determination theory, or SDT, of DC and Ryan, I discovered that A. We all need 3 basic needs to be met in order to feel safe and harness our motivation. These 3 needs are absolutely universal for all humans. Yes, they checked this thoroughly. The needs are autonomy, making my own choices, being in charge of my own life, and doing things in a way that is meaningful and suited to my uniqueness. Competence, feeling like I am good enough, I am capable, I can manage what I need to. And relatedness, belonging, being valued, feeling connected, and able to care and be cared for. To the extent that these 3 needs are met, I will be able to accept your support, respect your advice, and feel motivated to make use of what you offer me. To the extent that these needs are not met, I will struggle to trust you and will not feel motivated and will find it hard to comply with advice or support you try to give me. Also from DC and Ryan, I learned that B. Autonomous motivation is sustainable. Controlled motivation is not. What this means is that if it's my own idea and I want to do it for my own completely internal reasons, I will be able to stick with it and do whatever it takes and maintain my gains. If it's your idea and you are persuading or encouraging or rewarding or threatening me, and I want to do it to please you, obey you, or get the reward or avoid the pain, then I will find it very hard to stick with it, and will only be able to stay on task while you actively keep me at it, and will be unlikely to maintain my gains. 3. Last but not least, I learned by reading about Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. We need an optimal balance between skill level and challenge level. If a challenge feels too much bigger than our current skill level can rise to, we become anxious and disengage from the task. If our skill level is too high for the challenge we face, we become bored. When there's a challenge size just right for our next skills stretch, we become so engaged we find it hard to stop engaging and learning. We're in the sweet spot. We excel, we learn, we grow. Humans enjoy learning more than almost anything else. This is why we master things for no other reason than the love of doing so. We crave flow states. They're key to our happiness and well-being. If certain activities fail to give us flow states, we will opt for those that do give us flow states. If our general anxiety levels are high, we will choose things that offer low levels of challenge. Only as we move into feeling safe are we able to engage with things that offer higher levels of challenge. Last but not least, when it comes to pressure, once we are confident and highly skilled at something, a bit of pressure can help us hit peak performance. However, while we are still struggling to master a skill, pressure can kill off performance completely. This can lead to feelings of incompetence and shame, and make it almost impossible to improve our skills. And so we come full circle to what I learned from reading Porges. To sum up, try to get somebody else to do something you believe is good for them in ways you think are right for them while you stay in charge of the activity, and you generally undermine the relationship, making it harder for them to receive your offering, making it harder for them to stay motivated and engaged, making it more likely that they will get poor results, making it more likely that they will feel shamed, making it more likely they will become anxious, making it harder for them to engage with the task, as well as further undermining the relationship. On the other hand, allow somebody to do what feels meaningful to them in their own time and their own way, using you as an assistant as they wish, and you generally increase their sense of safety as well as relatedness, making it easier for them to stay motivated and engaged, making it more likely they will get good results, making it more likely they will feel competent, making it more likely they will experience flow, making it more likely that they will not only learn effectively but keep on loving the learning and doing more and more of it. What this adds up to is that teaching reading without consent is automatically going to make it harder for any young person to learn than if they have a genuine choice in the matter. Add to that teaching them in a way that doesn't fit their learning styles and you make it harder still. Add to that doing it before their brain is ready and you make it harder still. Add to that an environment where they feel pressured and even shamed, and where relationships are shaky, and you can make it almost impossible. Add to that a dyslexic brain. On the other hand, there is no critical period for learning to read. At the point that someone becomes autonomously motivated, whether that's at age 4, 7, 11, or 14, or even as an adult like Amir, that's when they're most likely to succeed. If there isn't any dyslexia in SDE, what is there in SDE? We've never taught reading, says Daniel Greenberg from the Sudbury Valley School in the same interview with Lenore Skenazy. If they don't teach reading at SVS, how do the kids learn it? Sudbury Valley School practices a form of education that has variably come to be termed self-directed education, SDE, and or natural learning. Bearing in mind what we've just looked at in terms of motivation, here are two contrasting lists, probably not comprehensive, but covering a number of aspects of the learn-to-read process in STE compared to the process in most types of school. These lists are not in a particular order, but have rather been numbered so that we can easily contrast them point by point. In self-directed education, such as that practiced at Sudbury Valley School, young people learn to read when they are ready, whatever age that may be. Usually this is somewhere between 4 and 14, with a rough average around 8.5 years of age. Before 4 and after 14 are also considered to be just fine, although they are extremely rare. How is this different to school? In school, children are taught reading at the age prescribed by the system, which may be as young as 4 in Montessori, usually 5 or 6 in public education, or as old as 9 in the Waldorf system. In other words, later than some children are ready and long before others are ready. Reading in the toddler years is considered to be hyperlexia, and most children unable to read by the expected age are considered to have learning difficulties. The second contrast. In SDE, sometimes children learn in a short-term fugue of non-stop progress, sometimes in many installments over many years with lengthy periods of no apparent literacy activity. While in school, they learn in measured installments that stay steady and consistent continuously day after day without significant breaks for years. Number 3, in SDE, they learn only when they choose to, while in school, they learn without regard for their desires and often actively against their will. Number 4, in SDE, they learn knowing that they are valued, cared for, appreciated, and allowed to stay whether or not they ever learn to read. In school, they learn while feeling that much of their value as people and positive feedback from others is conditional on their success, and knowing that they can and will be separated from peers and adult helpers depending on their reading results. Number 5, in SDE, they learn according to their own biorhythms. You may notice later that in both of the longer case stories, all reading progress happened last thing at night, for example. Whereas in school, they learn against their biorhythms at the times of day that suit the system. Number 7, in SDE, they learn with no pressure at all. Reading is no more or less rewarded than tree climbing skills. In school, they learn loaded with pressure. They are given both implicit and explicit messages that almost nothing matters more than reading. Number 8, in SDE, they learn by methods of their own choosing, often of their own invention, methods which change and evolve as needed. In school, they learn by imposed methods, determined by the institution according to pedagogical philosophy and or current fads. Number 9. In SDE, they learn in ways that allow for a full expression of personal creativity, adventure, and delight. Whereas in school, they learn in ways that not only discourage but actually penalize and sometimes even punish creativity. Number 10. In SDE, they learn within a supportive context where reading is not artificially elevated in importance, and where their progress is not judged or even evaluated. In school, they learn within a judgmental value system that both links literacy to personal worth and constantly evaluates progress in a judgmental way. Number 11, in SDE, they learn without shame. No staff member makes them feel like they should be able to read already. Whereas in school, they learn in ways that do shame. There is an insistence that young people must work to manage what they cannot manage. And finally, for this list, in SDE, they learn in a way that supports them in feeling their progress and competence at every stage, rather than making them aware of the deficits still to overcome. While in school, the circumstances are stacked to emphasize incompetence and de-emphasize strengths and particle progress. In other words, SDE optimizes for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, while most other education systems undermine all three. SDE allows reading to happen through autonomous motivation, while most other education systems rely on controlled motivation. And SDE optimizes for flow, while most other education systems actively prevent experiences of flow. What is the outcome of these two different types of approach to education? For the non-SDE systems, the bulk of young people are reading at around age 6 or 7, with some, in America maybe as many as 19%, not achieving functional literacy at all by the time they leave school. For SVS, it's zero functional illiteracy and a wide span of ages at which young people have learned to read, without much difference in the final picture between those who learned early and those who learned late. To quote from Daniel Greenberg in the Sudbury Valley School Experience, "What we have had is children who have started reading at a very wide range of ages. We've had some who started at 4 or 5, that's what everybody likes to hear, and we've had others who started at 9, 10, even later. When you look at a person who isn't reading at the age of 8, you know that person in a standard school setting would be put in a remedial reading class and subjected to enormous pressures. But if you stay your course, as we have stayed our course over the years, and you leave that person alone and let them develop at their own pace, the miracle always seems to happen. By the time they leave, you wouldn't know the difference between those who started reading at 4 and those who started at 11. Of course, one of the enormous impacts of a failure to learn to read young is the knock-on effect for the rest of the educational career, if you're in a mainstream schooling system. Most schools push early reading in order to create a foundation for other learning, and young people learning as late as many at SVS would be severely compromised. So, it's also important to look at the educational picture beyond just literacy. How do young people learn when we compare the two systems with regard to the rest of what we commonly consider to be education? In self-directed education, such as that practiced at Sudbury Valley School, young people learn skills and content entirely through self-chosen activity. Nobody else decides what you should or shouldn't do, within the bounds only of other people's rights and the school rules. Most learning happens through direct life experience, open-ended experimentation and play. Conversation is probably the primary medium for giving and receiving information, and argument and debate are a common way to explore and integrate what is being learned. Active age mixing means that young people with more knowledge or experience consolidate their learning by assisting others who are still grappling with the basics. And in turn, the beginners get personalized assistance from learners who are just a few steps ahead and still able to relate to the struggles of a half-formed grasp of the material. In SDE, observing other people in real-life activity is often a way for learning to begin, followed by one's own experimentation and cooperative activity, often leading up to learning through direct relationships with mentors for advanced levels of skill. It's also increasingly common these days to learn from watching videos. Obviously, plenty of learning still happens through reading, but this is optional depending on preference. Likewise, many young people in SDE learn by writing and documenting, or not, again, depending on preference. Where learning happens as a result of engaging with challenges set by other people, this is completely optional and voluntary. In other words, although reading is useful to young people in SDE, they are free to learn as much as they like in other ways. The world at large provides an incentive to learn to read. Immersion in a literate environment makes it easy to the point of inevitability, but there's not an actual pressure to learn to read. And if, as has never happened yet at SVS, some young person did not learn to read, they would have intact confidence and many other well-developed coping skills to be at least as educated and capable as Clark's successful illiterate men. How is this different to mainstream school? In school, children learn primarily through reading, writing, and documenting. If they can't do these three things, most of the other resources offered are closed to them. They also learn from listening to lectures, filling in worksheets, rote memorization, completing mandatory assignments, and generally following instructions, even for work that is meant to be experiential. They are age-segregated, the system is inherently competitive, and attempts at collaboration are disallowed as cheating. None of this is conducive to meeting motivational needs, and very little of this provides opportunity for flow states. So, how could school create dyslexia? Given what we know about motivation, it's easy to see why young people can harness their full motivational drive to overcome all obstacles to reading when they are embedded in self-directed education. It even makes sense of Amir Baraka's suddenly ability to learn to read in prison, when he hadn't ever managed until then. On the other hand, given that motivation and learning ability are impacted when we feel that other people are in charge of our actions, when we come to doubt our own competence, when relationships are damaged, and when we feel anxious, it's easy to see how even non-dyslexic young people often come to develop a level of reading allergy when pushed to learn to read at school. As Csikszentmihalyi points out, many people stop learning after they leave school. The long years of education often leave behind unpleasant memories. Their attention manipulated by textbooks and teacher, they look at graduation as the first day of freedom. Contrast this norm with the fact that SDE facilities often have to deal with young people loving school so much they don't want holidays, their passionate enjoyment and delight in learning, and the unusually high proportion of SVS graduates who go on to tertiary studies. Dyslexic is a term for problems that result from inadequate instruction, and it's often used to point out that teachers need training in multisensory phonics-based reading tuition methods. But what if dyslexic is an even more telling word than that? What if it is not as much the style of teaching, but the imposition of teaching that is the problem? What if any kind of teaching, no matter how competent, that is imposed against the deep consent of the learner is at the heart of the problem? Not only for dyslexia, but for all of the other forms of misery and failure we currently consider just part of school. A more detailed discussion of these dynamics is beyond the scope of this book, but can be found in the first of my books on SDE facilitation, Helping the Butterfly Hatch, Book 1, How Self-Directed Education Works and Why. So here's my hypothesis. It's perfect that Greenberg says, we've never had a case of dyslexia. It's not that they never had any dyslexics enroll. It's just that none of those dyslexics ever developed a case of dyslexia, precisely because nobody tried to teach them to read. In fact, this is exactly what Greenberg says in the Sudbury Valley School experience. It could be an accident. The students who attended SVS might just happen not to be in that 10 to 15%, but it doesn't work that way. There's no pre-selection of non-dyslexic people in this place. We haven't had dyslexia because we haven't brought it about, is what he says. Let's play with possibilities just for fun. Let's return to myself and Sir Steve. Born in the same year, but I was born in August, and in a place where the school year starts in January. He was born in October, in a place where the school year starts in September. I'm betting he started school a month before turning 6, while I started at 6.5. We already know that in age-segregated and standardized education systems, summer-born children are often at a disadvantage due to their lack of physical maturity relative to their peers. I learned to read in my own time and my own way. I don't know exactly when. Let's just pretend for a minute that it was when I was exactly 6 and 4 months old, and that Sir Steve and I were soul twins, and that he would, left to his own devices, have done exactly the same. Except that by then, other people had been trying to get him to read in their way under pressure for a third of a year already. It is completely plausible that this could have interfered with his confidence and motivation sufficiently to make the difference between his dyslexia and my probable dyslexia. Had I been born in the Northern Hemisphere, I might have shared his fate. Next, let's imagine a different soul twin, someone born just 10 years ago. My own preschool experience was of the old-fashioned kind, sing-songs and nursery rhymes, finger painting, playing with other tots, listening to stories and getting muddy. My this-century twin more likely would have been given desk work by the age of 4. This also could make the difference between my probably dyslexia and their dyslexia. How might alternative education facilitate dyslexia without creating dyslexia? Next to enter our journey is a literacy expert who specializes in teacher training, who has spent multiple decades in Australia and America studying the classroom habits of teachers whose students achieve exceptionally high levels of success in learning to read. It is interesting to me that although Brian Camborne does not appear to be acquainted with self-directed education, through studying success in literacy learning, he has independently arrived at many conclusions that align with aspects of SDE. For example, he emphasizes the importance of the message that it is safe to have a go in this setting. He also emphasizes that children should be given responsibility for their learning, be supported in constructing their own approximations, which should be affirmed rather than marked as mistakes, and they should be trusted to learn in their own time with as little hurry as possible. This suggests to me that to the extent that any educational facility deeply respects young people as protagonists in their own learning, as well as creates an environment of safety where there is little stress about literacy learning, they could facilitate dyslexia more often than dyslexia. Sure enough, during the course of writing this booklet, I discovered that Sudbury Valley School is not the only alternative school to encounter a complete lack of cases of dyslexia. Célestine Freinet, a French educator, founded not only one school, but a whole modern school movement back in the 1920s. After decades of experience, by the year before his death in the mid-1960s, Freinet had come to the conclusion that dyslexia simply did not show up in his form of education. Watching the gradual increase of dyslexia cases in other forms of schooling, he speculated that it was the result of, quote, growing difficulty for children to comply with school practices. Freinet found confirmation for the speculation in the work of French psychologist Roger Mouchieli, author of I maybe need some pronunciation on these names. Just let me know, and I can always redo. Freinet found confirmation for this speculation in the work of French psychologist Roger Mouchieli, author of Dyslexia, Malady of the Century, whose work led him to the conclusion that reading problems were a result of young people feeling pressured by the duty to read. Freinet schools, by removing this duty and allowing young people to take ownership of their learning in a more empowered, positive, and less coerced way, did not produce cases of dyslexia. He concluded that, except in rare cases of organic deficiency, dyslexia is a product of the school. When it comes to forms of self-directed education practiced in ways and places other than schools, Carl Wheatley goes so far as to actively suggest that schools could improve their literacy outcomes by taking inspiration from unschooling, where also young people are in charge of their own learning and under no pressure to read. He points out that, quote, the approach to learning to read that is most effective in the long run in classrooms is interest-based learning that is connected to real life and that has large doses of freedom and choice. That is, while traditional reading instruction is actually one of the leading causes of reading problems. In answer to the thought that in all these instances so far the community of young people was possibly in various ways self-selecting and may have had exceptionally autodidactic temperaments, I came across a very interesting 30-year existence of the School of the Third Kind, facilitated by Bernard Collot. This was not an independent or private school, but a unique situation within a public school, where the dissolution of several classes circumstantially led to Collot finding ways to deal with an age-mixed classroom for all primary school levels up to age 10. Faced with the unusual challenge presented by not being able to teach age-segregated grades, Collot drew inspiration from both Freinet and Montessori. Gradually, in a process that sounds like the usual process that homeschooling families often go through, progressively prioritizing young people's well-being and best interests to organically find that they have become unschoolers, this section of the school became a place where young people had full educational autonomy. Parents who held the fair enough expectation that their children would cope well with the transition to regular high school work at age 11 were not only satisfied, but the model worked so well that the village chose to sustain it for as long as possible, which meant that eventually Collot had 3 full decades of experience to draw on. He remarks that statistically speaking, there must have been multiple dyslexics in his progression of classes, yet he never once encountered a case of dyslexia. Here's what I managed to translate using DeepL Free version. I can tell you that all the children in my school have learned to read, to write at one time or another, each in their own way. Of course, I helped them at those times to find their bearings, to understand and make themselves understandable, but I am unable to say whether it was through the elements I brought them that they learned. I'm even sure that their brains had used many other reference points drawn from the informal writing in which they were immersed in my school and elsewhere. Not one of them was learning in the same way. The important thing for me was no longer to make children learn what I had planned and paid for them to learn, but to give them all the conditions so that they could develop the tools to learn for themselves. As for conventional methods of reading instruction, Collot cautions us that methods are often very inhibitory when we force the brain to work in the way we think it works. My very quick, modest, and informal outreach to the alternative education community in the course of writing this current text also yielded a response from alternative education veteran Jerry Mintz. Jerry recalls that the modern school in the USA, which was part of the movement initiated by Spanish anarchist Francisco Ferrer, a different modern school to Freinet's, which operated from 1914 to 1953, also didn't push students to learn to read, with no negative outcomes. Jerry recalls one particular student from those times. To quote him, he wasn't interested in learning to read until he was 10. Then he wanted to read a particular book. His mother asked why he wanted that book when he couldn't read. He said, "I'll learn to read that book." Months later, he was reading voraciously. He eventually got a scholarship to Columbia Medical School and became a famous pediatrician. I met another one there who didn't learn until he was 9 and became a psychiatrist. My outreach also led to my receiving news about an alternative school in Canada, sadly now closed after almost 50 years of successful service due to technical changes in district funding. The philosophy of the school was unique to its founder, but essentially non-coercive and provided educational autonomy, while also actively offering, unlike Sudbury Valley School, a range of methods for literacy support. Rather than pursuing an either-or approach, the school embraced the idea of whole language within an immersive literacy environment with a focus on high-interest words, but with phonics information shared with readers who were busy learning. Funny and engaging beginner books were provided rather than just boring readers. I am told that from 1971 till 2019, every single student learned to read eventually, and no student expressed regret at not having been made to read earlier. Again, when the rest of education is not held back by being unable to read, there is plenty to explore and enjoy until reading readiness arrives. Also, when there is a culture that immerses young people in demonstrations of literacy, but that nonetheless does not artificially prize eye reading, there is little social discomfort for those who come to it later. The interesting thing about this more active provision of literacy support in the Canadian school is that it was clearly visible that a very small number of students did not make significant progress in spite of their efforts and in spite of all the support offered. These young people showed other signs of dyslexia, such as later being unable to spell and struggling to get their thoughts down on paper, and as suitable technology became available, being greatly relieved to be able to use it. However, what this school found was that, without exception, the picture changed after puberty. Somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14, they all somehow managed to learn to read. all with excellent comprehension, reaching grade level within a year. What if? What if Greenberg, not paying any particular attention to anybody's learn-to-read process, because it's actively against SVS policy to evaluate anyone's progress, simply gave each and every student long enough for even the tiniest percentile of young people to transmute their own dyslexia into dyslexia? That's quite a thought. The clincher for me is this. Both Greenberg and Freinet actually did engage with young people who came to their schools illiterate and already having been elsewhere diagnosed with dyslexia. Here's a piece of evidence that comes to us by a researcher, Dr. Peter Gray. To quote, "In my study of Sudbury Valley graduates, 2 of the respondents told me independently that they had come to the school as teenagers, unable to read. Both had been passed along from grade to grade in public school with the diagnosis of dyslexia. Both told me that they learned to read within a few months after enrolling at Sudbury Valley. When I asked why they could learn there what they had been unable to learn before, they both told me, in effect, that for the first time in their lives, nobody cared if they could read. The pressure was off. Now, in a relaxed way, they could concentrate on reading. They didn't have to hide behind a label." Critically important to another question many people have around whether SDE simply masks significant problems, Gray adds that both went on to college with no designation of dyslexia or any other learning disability and performed well there. And I found this from Freinet, again using DeepL automatic translation software, "There are no dyslexics in our classes, and this for children who start their learning according to our pedagogy. If they suffered during the first years of this confrontation with must read and must write, they risk being marked for all their schooling as by consequence of an illness. Healing is all the longer and more difficult the longer the child has suffered from this confrontation. It took us 3 years to re-educate a child who was massacred up to the age of 10, as much by the bad school methods as by the bad remediation that had been imposed on him. In this rehabilitation, I noticed that the most serious consequence is that the child had totally lost the natural notion that one writes to say something, and that what one reads must also mean something. Words no longer placed in their vital cultural context no longer had any specific figure. The child writes and reads them at random from his distorted school memories. Our dyslexic has made us a beautiful poem today, with some mistakes still, of course, but he is healed and saved." In other words, it looks to me like the message that learning to read is critically important, the expectation that young people must keep working at it, and the pressure and potential shame that go along with all of this, as well as the strain it puts on young people's relationships with their adult companions, can actually prevent the development of competence at reading and cause stress-induced, lifelong cases of dyslexia. What if? What if the huge range in the estimates of the prevalence of dyslexia of between 5% and 20% could be due to the fact that actual dyslexia affects more like 5%, while the other 15% are simply more sensitive to stress, strong-willed, or reliant on positive relationships, and therefore less resilient in the face of mainstream schools' assault on their autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The key to deliberately healing dyslexia for Freinet seems to me to be centered in actively building a sense of positive relatedness, along with giving big doses of autonomy, along with positive relationship messages that lead to increases in perceived competence. The key to healing dyslexia at SVS as an unintentional but happy side effect of the deeply egalitarian treatment of young people seems to me to be grounded in deep autonomy, along with implicit support for unconditional assumptions of competence, within a space of positive relatedness. The plural of anecdote is not evidence. This aphorism was coined by political scientist and lecturer Raymond Wolfinger. The funny thing is that public use has turned it on its head. Here is his protest, quote, "I said the plural of anecdote is data, sometime in the 1969 to 70 academic year while teaching a graduate seminar at Stanford. The occasion was a student's dismissal of a simple factual statement by another student or me as mere anecdote. The quotation was my rejoinder. Of course, the plural of anecdote is data. That's exactly what qualitative research is. And when it comes to the social sciences, to human reality and information about how we learn best, then quantitative data tends to lose the real information by reductionism. Let's note, it is the reduction of a student's achievements to quantitative data that proves that a person with dyslexia is stupid. It is only by taking seriously their qualitative, anecdotal evidence that we realize that they are not. Just as quantitative data can be cherry-picked and manipulated, so can qualitative data. It's always foolish to jump to conclusions in either direction based on minimal evidence. I have not mentioned the multiple anecdotes from home education, nor even the formal studies of learning to read in home education, simply because it's already historically clear that there's standing cultural prejudice against home educators, and attempts to share their wisdom with the school world have already repeatedly failed, sadly for the young people who could have had happier lives. So what I am exploring right now is what has emerged from several completely unconnected schools in different countries, each of which has had decades of experience behind what I share from them here. If that's not the kind of evidence that convinces us that there's something to carefully consider, then what is? Is there any place for dyslexia remediation in SDE? As I prepared to write this text, I sent out a call to a number of facilities inspired by the Sudbury Valley School to find out what their experiences have been regarding dyslexia. I received very few responses, maybe due to pandemic conditions, maybe due to most SDE facilities just not being very interested in a subject that doesn't much affect them, or to having nothing to report because, like Greenberg, it's not something they've encountered. Given that there's no set age by which young people in SDE are supposed to learn to read, it is very, very rare for a young person in SDE to need more help than any handy literate adult can give, such as telling them how to spell a particular word. Generally, SDE folks confirm that young people, including those diagnosed with dyslexia elsewhere, who are given rich environments and plenty of access to supportive adults and other optimizing conditions for SDE that I won't go into here, can be trusted to figure things out for themselves and ask for whatever help they need once they decide they need it. One response came from Melissa Graham, who used to work as a reading specialist in mainstream schooling before becoming convinced that it was worth the effort to co-found a Sudbury-type facility that she now runs. Aside from being a reading specialist, she's also a dyslexia mom, whose son started reading at 11. I asked her if she thought there was ever a place for proactively intervening in a young person's reading process without being asked to do so. She replied, quote, "The only reason someone needs to intervene is to hijack the potential for the person to begin to tell themselves a negative self-story. The importance of naming a dyslexic is to protect their mental space and to guide or support the narrative into one that sings, 'Dyslexics are brilliant.' I was fortunate to discover that no one dyslexic is alike. They are all so very different and unique." The need to prevent negative self-stories was confirmed in an ironic way by another mother, who is staff at a different model of non-coercive alternative school. Her experience is that, quote, "Reading and math can be stymied when forced prematurely, and the skills can be learned at any age when the person willingly takes it on. There's no developmental window. It only takes a few months once people go for it, and reading the books they want to is the best way to gain fluency. But culturally, it's another matter. My kid's first book was Jurassic Park at age 10. He'd loved the movie and wanted the experience to last, so he sat on his bed with that book for a month and grasped the skill of reading. A happy story. But I much later learned that he actually thought he was stupid for mastering it later than his peers, and he never really got over that. He thought everyone loved him too much to tell him, 'Talk about a backfire.' What if? What if his thought that he was stupid possibly delayed his reading? What if, without that perception, he might have had the confidence to learn at 9? This issue is addressed in the final section of this book. What's important to note is that the efforts of Made by Dyslexia to create public awareness around the upside of dyslexia could make a significant difference to experiences like these. In the process of writing this text, I was also fortunate to be able to chat with Justine McConville, a reading specialist who offers reading assistance to young unschoolers who request it, while also being staff at the SDE Village Free School. She confirmed that she does see young people in SDE who are struggling and who do want help, although generally it is after they have already taken some damage in mainstream education or from social influences that buy into cultural myths and prejudices. The critical thing for her is that young people must remain in charge of the relationship and the help that is offered. Quote, "I only aspire to be in consent-based relationships. I have previously had the experience of being with kids who were not there by consent, and it's just wrong relationship. It burdens them emotionally even more, with the relationship they have with their own academic identity, and then on top of that, they have to do something against their will to fix what's wrong with them." Both of these responses embed the idea of supporting autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I invite you to watch a powerful conversation between Justine and a mainstream remedial teacher, Lynn, exploring the kinds of insights that I explore for myself within this text. If there's one and only one further thing you explore around dyslexia, it should be this. Talking about dyslexia, a conversation between Lynn Chambers and Justine McConville. A video that you can find on the YouTube channel of Free, F-H-R-E-E. When searching for potential criticisms of the perspective explored in this text, online I have seen that some people worry that young people with dyslexia in SDE will simply go undetected, creating an impression that there is no problem when in fact the problem is simply being left to get worse, terminally worse. What they're missing is the fact that young people in SDE are empowered. They're not sitting stuck invisibly at the back of some classroom languishing for lack of attention. They're used to making progress and achieving what they choose to achieve, and get openly and obviously frustrated when they get stuck. SDE kids are embedded in relationship. The few who do struggle with reading are very visible to the people around them, and they're free to ask for help. They may even be proactively offered help if their frustrations make them cranky and disruptive to others. However, their decisions about whether, when, and what help they do or don't need are respected. So far, I have yet to find even one single story about a young person in SDE who had not thoroughly resolved their reading struggles by the age of 18. It's not that young people in SDE are unable to get help if they genuinely need it. It's that it isn't imposed on them. It's that when it is done, it is with their deep consent, the kind of true consent that involves mutual desire, rather than resigned acceptance or capitulation out of fear when given the message that the other options will be even worse. Illustrating this beautifully, I received a message from a mother who is also staff at a Sudbury-type school with 4 children of her own. The eldest 2 learned to read easily without help between the ages of 8 and 9. However, the 3rd child, whom we will call Jay, became increasingly stressed about reading after trying at 7, at 8, and still at 9. She was trying and making no progress, and her mother could not work out whether the problem was motivational or something else. Jay became increasingly frustrated and began demanding help that her mother and others around her did not know how to give. So a reading specialist was sourced. Jay decided that she would like to try a session, during which it became clear that she was struggling with dyslexia. Since Sudbury-type schools bring in staff as needed and requested by young people, and Jay actively chose to have help with reading, the reading specialist came into school for around an hour a week to help her for around 2 years, until at 11 years old she felt she no longer needed the sessions anymore. Throughout that process, Jay was in charge of the relationship, choosing the day and time for sessions, free to end sessions early when she chose to, and also choosing what to work on, including help with learning her lines for the school play. The reading specialist, Miss S., also introduced Jay to cursive writing, something that many dyslexics find easier than print, and Jay took to it with enthusiasm. To quote her mother, "It wasn't that Miss S was teaching her, more like she helped Jay decode, and it all clicked very easily for Jay. I think because it was truly coming from her. She is so happy and empowered that she was in control of her learning to read and write. It is so great to see the two things that frustrated her most she fully enjoys now. She loves art and manages her own Instagram drawing page as well," says her mother. In an interesting twist that's quite common in SDE, to the surprise of people who haven't seen young people self-direct their screen time, Jay's reading also took a leap as a result of video gaming. To quote her mother, "Jay had been reading the graphic novel of Wings of Fire. She didn't feel ready for the chapter books yet. Unfortunately, while playing an online Wings of Fire game in April 2020, someone let out some spoilers that are only in the chapter books. Well, that propelled her to take on the challenge." This mother's youngest also has obvious dyslexia, but chose not to have help from Miss S. She successfully taught herself to read at the age of 10 without any specialist help. Did Daniel Greenberg never encounter a situation like Jay's? Is Jay dealing with a case of super severe, ultra-rare level of dyslexia that he would have encountered if his school were bigger? Maybe. My first thought was that maybe it's just a matter of the level of struggle that's tolerable for a mother to watch. At Sudbury Valley School, it's part of the philosophy that young people grapple deeply with things, struggle with things, and don't get rescued unless they turn around and ask for what they need. However, Jay read my first draft and corrected me on this. Her mother did not rescue her. Jay's determination is very strong, and nothing was going to stop her learning to read right there and then, no matter what. If she had been at Sudbury Valley School, she would likely have ensured that a reading specialist was engaged there too, as there was absolutely no way she was waiting another year or two. It is possible, with a different personality that could tolerate the wait, that Jay might eventually have been truly ready to learn to read without needing any particular help, like the Canadian youngsters mentioned, somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14. If reading specialists were to enter unschooling homes, alternative schools, and SDE facilities on a mission to identify young dyslexics, they would find plenty of them. The problem with diagnosis is that it is located within both time and context. Look a year or two later, and/or in a different context, and the problem may be resolved. The other danger is that help that isn't consensual can contribute to the problem. If you take a listen to the interview with Justine McConville, one of the things that you will hear her observe is that, quote, "when there's an emotional wall around reading and writing, which you will see almost always if you're forcing it, that becomes the greatest barrier now. It's not phonetics or anything like that. It's that through the process of reading intervention, this child has learned they are not able to, they're not smart enough, they can't do it, it's hard, it's not fun. It's stressful. What if? What if the optimal picture is to leave young people in charge of their own educational choices while making sure that they are aware that there are accessible specialists on hand in case they choose to use them? And if they do use them, it's on their own terms. There's no reason that Jay should have had to wait until she was 14 and figure it out alone. Miss S supported her in her own choice to read earlier, and at 11 she is getting active pleasure out of reading and writing now, rather than having to wait. And on the other hand, in a supportive SDE environment, it is possible that young people who either don't want or don't manage to access a suitable assistant will be just fine anyway, given time. But let's concede, just for argument's sake, that there may be a subset of people who will never manage without professional help, and for whatever reason don't feel the necessary motivation to get it. Maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, some proportion small enough to have evaded both SVS and the other alternative schools reviewed here. Alternative schools are always small after all, one of the things that makes them so able to fulfill the core need for relatedness. What if some people with dyslexia really cannot manage to read without help? No chance whatsoever. But what if they also never get around to wanting help and are allowed to just go without it? Ben Foss, Another awesome dyslexic who invented the text-to-speech Intel reader got so sick of being encouraged to work on his eye reading that he actually asked his mother to imagine he was blind. Would she still try to get him to spend time learning to read with his eyes? He asked her. There's eye reading. There's also finger reading or braille. And there's also ear reading. Ben is perfectly happy ear reading, so hey, what's the problem, Mom? Why pressure a person with dyslexia to spend their time on eye reading in this day and age? Ben had better things to do with his time, as do many young dyslexics. As Lynn points out in the conversation with Justine, the considerable time spent on reading remediation is time lost to the development of strengths, passions, and talent. For young people, it's also time spent not playing, at a point in history when we already know that play skills are crucial to success in life and learning. Reading remediation on top of an already heavy imposed curriculum can pretty much kill off discretionary time, robbing a young dyslexic both of opportunities to experience their own competence as well as opportunities to hone the gifts that could be their actual life's purpose. The reasons for the disproportionate emphasis on eye reading all have to do with the way school is currently poorly designed, not because of our way of life today or in the future. By offering early diagnosis and effective intervention, a certain number of dyslexics can be helped to fit in and keep pace with the standardized curriculum. For many, this comes at a cost to self-esteem and a cost to the development of key talents. The argument is that it rescues their self-esteem from far worse damage and enables them to pass standardized tests. However, let's notice that no damage whatsoever to self-esteem is inevitable in the first place, and standardized tests might not be the actual holy grail of a young dyslexic's life. Take away the educational bias and social stress on literacy, and there's nothing to save them from. I have come across exactly one story of a man who decided not to struggle at all because reading simply didn't interest him, and who did leave Britain's famous Summerhill School at 16, illiterate by choice. I won't repeat the story of Freer here, since I write about this in more detail in Helping the Butterfly Hatch Book 1, How Self-Directed Education Works and Why. But the condensed version is this. His self-confidence was solid enough that he lived a very adventurous life traveling the planet for several years. Then, when, as an adult, he finally found a good reason to make the effort, he taught himself to read within 2 months and eventually went on to get a degree in economics.